Trembling beneath a cottonwood at dusk, a hunted Apache woman clutching a leather bundle to her chest was about to change everything. Though the lonely rancher who found her didn't yet know it, only that everyone he passed that evening warned him to turn her away. The last light of the day was sliding off the Arizona rimrock in long bands of golden rust, catching the dust that still hung in the air behind Daniel Harper's horse. And for a moment the whole basin below his cabin looked like it had been poured from a furnace and left to cool. He had spent the day mending a quarter-mile of fence line that the spring floods had torn loose, and every muscle in his back reminded him of it. All he wanted, riding those last 100 yards toward home, was a fire, a plate of beans, and the particular silence of a house with no one left in it to talk to. That silence was the one thing Daniel had stopped fighting a long time ago. He had come out to this stretch of the territory 11 years before, with a wife who did not live to see the second winter, and a brother who had gone east afterward and never written more than twice. The ranch had grown up around him in her absence. More cattle, more fence, more chores to fill the hours a man was not supposed to spend thinking about a grave he visited every Sunday, whether he meant to or not. Folks in the nearest town considered Daniel Harper solid, fair in a trade, slow to anger, and about as easy to draw into conversation as the rimrock itself. None of them would have named him a soft man, but none of them had watched him either. On the evenings he sat alone on that porch, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods and wondering who, besides the cattle, still needed him for anything. He had built the cabin himself, board by board, in the first summer after he'd staked the claim, back when the whole of that valley had seemed to him like a fresh page nobody else had written on yet. It hadn't stayed a fresh page for long. The territory filled in around him the way territories do. More wagons, more fences, more men with opinions about who belonged where and who didn't. And somewhere in the years of watching that fill-in happen, Daniel had come to hold a quieter view of the place than most of his neighbors did. He'd buried his wife in ground that had belonged, not so many years before, to people his neighbors mentioned only in the past tense, as though history were a door that could be closed once and stay closed. Daniel had never quite managed to believe that. He didn't talk about it in town because talk like that rarely changed a man's mind and only cost you standing at the mercantile. But he carried the thought with him anyway. The way he carried most things that mattered, quietly and without much need to prove it to anyone. So when he came around the last bend in the trail and saw her, a young woman sitting very still in the long shadow of the tree beside his cabin, dust ground into the seams of her clothing, a small leather bundle held against her chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Something in him recognized the shape of it before his mind caught up. She was watching him the way a person watches a threat they are too tired to run from anymore. Not defiant, not pleading, just alert, cataloging the distance between them the way a hawk measures a rifle. Her hair had come loose from its braid in places, and there was a raw scrape along one cheekbone that looked days old, not hours. Daniel stopped his horse well short of the tree and swung down slow, the way he'd learned to move around spook stock and let the reins drop. "Evening," he said, keeping his hands loose and visible at his sides. "You're welcome to the shade there. Are you hurt?" She gave no answer. Her eyes tracked him instead, unblinking, while her arms tightened fractionally around the bundle. And Daniel understood plainly that whatever trust she still owned in the world had been spent down to almost nothing. Before he could try again, hoofbeats sounded on the trail behind him, and two riders he recognized from town slowed as they passed, close enough to be heard, not close enough to stop. "Leave her be, Harper." The writer's voice wasn't unkind so much as tired, the way a man repeats advice he's given a dozen times already that season. "She's not your trouble to take on." The other only shook his head. "You'll bring grief on yourself, taking in one of them. Ain't worth it." They rode on without waiting for a reply, dust rising pink behind them in the last of the light, and the woman beneath the tree lowered her eyes and drew the bundle in even tighter, as if she expected Daniel to finish the thought the writers had started. He didn't. He stood there a moment, turning their words over, weighing them against the plain fact in front of him. A young woman alone, hurt, out of food and water, by the look of her, with nowhere left standing between her and the coming dark. Whatever grief the writers imagined he'd bring on himself, it didn't add up against that. He walked past her without a word into the cabin and came back out a few minutes later with a full bucket of water and a cloth-wrapped basket that held the last of the morning's bread and a handful of dried apricots. He set both down on the ground a careful distance from her, close enough to reach, far enough not to crowd her, and stepped back to give her room. "Nobody should go hungry on my land while I've got bread in the house." His tone left no room for argument. "That's all this is." For a long moment she only looked at the water and then at him, measuring something in his face the way she'd measured the distance a minute before. Then slowly she came forward, knelt, and lifted the bucket in both hands, drinking like a person who had been rationing herself for days. When she finally lowered it, she wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist and studied him one more time, her voice quiet and careful when it finally came, like she was testing whether English still worked the same way it had the last time she'd needed it among strangers. "My name is Ayana. I am Daniel." Something in the plainness of the exchange seemed to ease a little of the guard in her shoulders, though not the grip on the bundle, which never loosened, not even to eat. He didn't press her for a story. He'd learned enough in 11 years of frontier life to know that a person who has just survived something doesn't always have the words for it yet. And sometimes the kindest thing a man can offer is simply not asking. He led her to the covered porch, out of the wind that had begun picking up off the flats, spread a clean wool blanket over the bench there, and lit a lantern against the coming dark. "You're safe here tonight." He left it at that, retreating inside to bank the fire and give her the privacy of not being watched. Through the window he could see her sitting very upright against the porch post for a long while, the lantern light catching the silver thread of scars a hard journey leaves, before exhaustion finally won out and she slept, the leather bundle still tucked beneath one arm like a second heartbeat. Morning came up soft and rose-colored over the eastern ridge, and Daniel found her already awake when he stepped outside with 2 cups of coffee. She accepted hers with both hands again, the way she seemed to accept everything, as though gratitude itself were a careful, deliberate act rather than a reflex. "There's apples wanting picking, if you're feeling up to it," he said, not as a demand, only an offer of something ordinary to fill the hours. She nodded, and for the first time something like relief crossed her face, the relief he would understand much later, of being handed work instead of pity. They walked out to the small orchard together in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as careful, 2 strangers learning the shape of each other's quiet. She worked steadily beside him that first morning, filling her basket faster than he filled his own, and it was there among the apple trees, sun climbing warm over the rimrock, that Daniel first saw her laugh, quiet and surprised out of her, at the sight of him nearly losing his footing on a low branch he'd misjudged. She covered her mouth afterward as though the sound itself might cost her something, but Daniel found he didn't mind the near tumble one bit if that was the price of hearing it. It struck him, picking himself up and brushing the dust from his trousers, that he could not remember the last time this orchard had held any sound in it, besides wind and the creak of branches, and he decided then, without quite framing it as a decision, that he would very much like to hear that laugh again before the apples ran out. The days that followed folded into a rhythm neither of them had expected to want. Ayana turned out to have a gift with the horses that put Daniel's own patience to shame. She calmed a 2-year-old colt that had thrown every hand who'd tried to gentle him, simply by standing at the fence line each morning until the animal came to her on its own terms rather than his. My father taught me that animals trust calm hearts before they trust loud voices, she confided one evening, the closest thing to a story she'd given him yet, and he filed the sentence away like a small gift, turning it over more than once in the quiet after supper. She mended a saddle he'd been meaning to fix for a season, her stitches finer and stronger than his own, and she moved through the vegetable rows behind the cabin with the unhurried competence of someone who had spent a lifetime coaxing food from difficult ground. Evenings became their own kind of ritual, small and unremarkable, and, for that very reason, precious. Daniel would come in from the last chores of the day to find coffee already made, and they would sit on the porch steps while the light went from gold to violet to the deep blue that swallowed the rimrock whole, trading the sparse, easy talk of two people who had stopped needing to fill every silence with words. She wondered aloud once why he lived so far out, alone, with nobody but the cattle for company, and he found himself telling her the truth before he'd quite decided to, about his wife, about the grave he visited on Sundays, about the particular ache of a house built for two people that had only ever, in the end, held one. Ayana listened without interrupting. The way he'd come to understand was simply her way of listening to everything, and when he finished, her only reply was quiet. Then we are both keeping company with people who are not here anymore. It wasn't much as comfort went, but it landed somewhere Daniel hadn't expected it to, and he found himself sleeping a little easier that night than he had in longer than he could remember. What never moved through any of it was the leather bundle. She kept it near her at every hour, beside her at meals, tucked under her arm while she worked the garden, resting against her hip while she sat mending in the evening light. Daniel noticed the way a careful man notices everything eventually, but he never pried. He had his own drawer of things he didn't talk about. His wife's hairpin, still in the cabin's one good dresser, a letter from his brother he'd never gotten around to writing back, and he understood a person's right to carry their grief in whatever shape they chose to carry it. If Ayana needed to hold that bundle the way some men held a rifle, that was hers to hold. His only job, as he saw it, was to make sure she had a safe porch to hold it on. Word travels fast in thin country, and it wasn't many days before Daniel felt the shift in how the town regarded him. A shopkeeper who'd known him for years grew short with him over an order of nails. A neighbor who used to wave from the road now rode past with his hat pulled low, eyes fixed straight ahead. None of them raised it to his face twice, but the current beneath their silence was plain enough. A man who took in an Apache stranger and posed no questions was a man inviting trouble onto land the rest of them had to live near. Daniel weighed their disapproval the way he weighed weather, filed it away, and went on with his work. He had buried a wife on this land once already. He was not about to let a handful of uneasy neighbors tell him what kindness he was, and wasn't allowed to offer a person in need. One of the two men from that first evening on the trail found him alone at the feed store a week later and didn't bother with pleasantries. "Folks are talking, Harper," he said, arms crossed, blocking the doorway just enough to make the conversation feel less than optional. "Man keeping company with one of them, out there alone, nobody watching. You don't know what kind of trouble follows a woman like that." Daniel set down the sack of grain he'd been carrying and looked the man square in the eye, unhurried. "I know she was hungry and hurt and had nowhere else to go," he said. "That's the only kind of trouble I've seen so far. If more comes, I expect I'll handle it the same way I handle everything else on my land, myself." The man held his gaze a moment longer, searching for an argument that didn't quite come, then stepped aside without another word. Daniel carried on with his errand, feeling no lighter for the exchange, but no less certain of the choice he'd made either. He had noticed, riding home that evening, that being right about a thing and being popular for it were rarely the same road. If you're enjoying Ayana and Daniel's story, consider becoming a channel member. Just tap join beside the channel name to help us keep bringing you stories like this one. It was on a breezy afternoon, nearly 3 weeks in, that the bundle finally betrayed its secret, not by choice but by accident. Ayana had set it on a porch chair while she carried water in from the well, and a gust caught the old softened leather and sent it tumbling to the grass, the worn cord at its mouth giving way on impact. Daniel, coming around the corner of the cabin at that exact moment, saw the contents scatter across the ground before Ayana did. A stack of yellowed papers folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. A silver medallion on a broken length of cord, worn smooth on one face from years of being touched, and a square of hide inked with careful lines that Daniel recognized, once he looked closer, as a hand-drawn map. Ayana crossed the yard so fast the water bucket went over sideways, and for one instant Daniel saw something in her face he hadn't seen since the night he'd first found her under the cottonwood. Pure, unguarded fear. She dropped to her knees and gathered the papers with both hands, pressing them flat against her chest, checking each one the way a person checks a wound to see how bad it truly is. Daniel didn't move to help. He only crouched a respectful distance away and waited until her breathing slowed and the fear in her eyes eased into something closer to exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't touch them. I only wanted to see nothing was damaged." Ayana looked up at him for a long moment, the medallion still clutched in one fist, and something in her seemed to finally set down a weight she'd been carrying since the cottonwood. "These belong to my family," she said, her voice unsteady in a way it hadn't been before. "One day I will tell you why they matter. I am not ready yet, but I promise you, Daniel, one day." He nodded, and that was the whole of it. He gathered the loose bucket, refilled it at the well without a word about what he'd just seen, and let the subject close as gently as it had opened. That night, though, lying awake and listening to the wind work through the cottonwoods, he found himself turning the pieces over anyway. A map, a medallion, letters kept safe through what must have been a hard and hunted road. Whatever story Ayana was guarding, it was clearly bigger than the two of them, bigger than this ranch, and he found that the not knowing didn't trouble him the way it might have troubled a less patient man. He had asked nothing of her the night he found her, and he wasn't about to start charging interest on that kindness now. Trust, once it starts moving, tends to move both directions. And over the following days, Ayana began to talk more freely, in pieces, the way a person parcels out something precious so it will last. She told him about growing up in the foothills to the north, about a mother who wove blankets so fine that traders came from 3 days' ride to buy them, about a father who could read an approaching storm in the color of the light over the ridgeline before anyone else in camp had noticed the sky changing at all. Carefully in pieces, she opened up about the unrest that had scattered her family's band 2 winters back. Soldiers moving through the territory, some bands pushed onto reservation land far from the places that held their history, others splitting apart in the confusion, families losing each other in the chaos of forced marches and hurried, frightened decisions made in the dark. Ayana had been separated from her father during one such crossing and had spent the better part of a year moving alone between the camps of relatives and the occasional kindness of strangers, always with the bundle, always watching the horizon for riders who might decide a lone Apache woman was easier prey than a person. That last part she said plainly, without asking for pity, the way a person states a fact of weather. There were men on the frontier, she explained, bounty riders and opportunists both, who saw a woman traveling alone as a woman who belonged to no one and therefore to anyone willing to claim her. Men who'd once tried to stop her on the trail 3 weeks before she reached Daniel's land. Men she had outrun only because she knew the country better than they did, and because she'd been raised never to stop moving once she sensed the shape of a threat. It was those same men, or others like them, that the 2 riders on the trail had likely been warning Daniel about, in their clumsy, fearful way, not danger from Ayana, but danger that might follow her, danger a man who took her in might have to stand between her and. She told him too about the year itself, sleeping in washes and behind rock outcrops, learning which ranches along her route might spare a meal without asking too many questions, and which would set dogs on her before she'd cleared the property line, trading small mended items for food when she had nothing else to offer, and always keeping the bundle within arm's reach, because losing it, she said, would have meant losing the only proof that her family had ever been more than scattered names in other people's memories. She did not tell it as a tale of suffering, though Daniel heard the suffering in it plainly enough between her measured sentences. She told it instead, the way a person recounts a long, hard job finally finished, with a kind of tired, clear-eyed pride that this was a road she had walked and survived, on her own terms, however much it had cost her to do it. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting, the way he'd learned to listen to a spooked animal's whole story before deciding how to approach it. And when she finished, he said only, "Then it's a good thing my porch has a clear view of the trail." It wasn't much of a joke, but it startled a short, surprised laugh out of her, the first one he'd heard, and something eased between them after that, a settling, like 2 horses in the same pasture, finally agreeing on a shared patch of shade. The weeks after that carried a warmth neither of them had planned for, though neither of them named it as anything more than what it plainly was, the deep, quiet comfort of 2 people who had each been alone longer than either liked to admit, finding in each other's company a kind of rest. Ayana taught Daniel a handful of words in her own language, laughing softly at his flattened vowels and making him repeat them until he got close enough not to embarrass himself. Daniel in turn showed her the best fishing bend in the creek that cut through the eastern pasture, and the 2 of them spent more evenings than either would have predicted sitting on the bank in companionable silence, watching the light change on the water. It was not a courtship, and neither of them ever spoke of it as one. It was something else, older and in some ways sturdier, the kind of bond built between people who have chosen to trust each other without asking anything in return. Daniel found himself, for the first time in years, glad to hear another set of footsteps on his porch boards in the morning. Ayana, for her part, began to sleep through full nights again, the bundle still close at hand, but no longer clutched the way a person clutches the only thing standing between them and disaster. The friendship proved itself in smaller ways too, the kind that mattered more for being unplanned. Daniel came in from repairing the eastern fence line one afternoon with a deep gash across his forearm, torn open on a length of wire that had come loose. And by the time he reached the cabin, the bleeding had soaked clean through his sleeve. Ayana had him sit at the table before he'd finished explaining what happened, cleaning the wound with a steadiness that made plain this was not the first injury she'd tended in her life. She crushed a handful of leaves gathered from along the creek bank into a paste and pressed it against the cut. Binding it with a strip of clean cloth, her hands quick and sure in a way that made Daniel's own fumbling doctoring look foolish by comparison. "My mother taught me this." Her voice was matter-of-fact, unbothered by his curiosity about the plant. "It could stop a fever, too, if you caught it early enough." He watched her work in the lantern light, struck by how much of what she carried in her hands and her memory the frontier around them had never once bothered to ask about, and he found himself grateful, in a way he didn't entirely have words for, that she'd been willing to share even this small piece of it with him. The wound healed clean within the week, faster than any injury he could remember, and he never did find a way to properly thank her for it beyond making sure her coffee was always the first cup poured from then on. It was on one of those quiet evenings, weeks later, that Daniel noticed the figure. He had gone out to check on a mare due to foal within the week, and as he crossed the yard he caught, just for a moment, the outline of someone standing at the crest of the far ridge, motionless against the last color of the sunset. By the time he'd blinked and looked again, the figure was gone, folded back into the deepening shadow of the hillside, as though it had never been there at all. He said nothing to Ayana that night, not wanting to spook a peace they'd both worked hard to build. But he found himself glancing at that ridgeline more than once over the following days, and he noticed, without remarking on it, that Ayana had begun glancing there too. The figure returned 3 more times over the following week, always at dusk, always gone before Daniel could be certain of what he'd seen. On the 4th evening, Ayana came to stand beside him at the fence rail as the light died over the western hills, and for a long while she stayed silent. "Someone is watching the ranch." Not a question. "I know." She was quiet again, her eyes fixed on the darkening ridge, and when she finally went on, there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly, but a taut, careful hope, the kind a person is almost afraid to let themselves feel because of how much it might cost to be wrong about it. It could be nothing, or it could be something I have waited 2 years for. Daniel didn't press her to explain further. He only reached over and covered her hand where it rested on the rail, a brief, steady gesture of the kind that needed no words attached to it, and the two of them stood there together until full dark came down over the ranch. If these frontier stories are worth your evenings, tap join beside the channel name and become a member of this channel to help keep more of them coming. The riders came at first light 3 mornings later, a line of them cresting the ridge just as the sun broke over it, dust rising gold around the hooves of their horses. Daniel was at the corral when he saw them, and he set down the bucket in his hand and called for Ayana without raising his voice too high, some instinct telling him this was not a moment for alarm. She came out of the cabin already knowing somehow, before she'd even reached the porch rail, her whole body going still the way it had that first evening under the cottonwood, except this time the stillness wasn't fear. "They have found me," she whispered, and Daniel heard, beneath the disbelief in her voice, something that sounded almost like the beginning of tears. "They are my people." The riders came down off the ridge at a measured pace, not a charge, and Daniel understood as they drew closer that whatever news had brought them here, it had traveled a long road to arrive. At the front of the group rode an older man with silver threaded through his dark hair, his back straight despite what looked like years of hard weather etched into his face. And the moment his eyes found Ayana standing at the porch rail, something in his composed bearing simply broke open. He was off his horse before the animal had fully stopped, closing the distance between them at something between a walk and a run, and Ayana came down off the porch to meet him with the bundle still held against her chest, as though even now, even here, she could not quite set it down. They embraced in the middle of the yard, her father's arms wrapped around her like a man reclaiming something he had spent 2 years believing he might never hold again. And neither of them said anything at all for a long moment, grief and relief so tangled together that words would only have gotten in the way. Daniel stood back near the corral fence, giving them the room such a moment deserved, watching a reunion play out that he understood plainly had been 2 years and a great deal of searching in the making. When Ayana's father finally lifted his head, his eyes were wet, and he looked past his daughter to the rancher standing a respectful distance off, studying Daniel for a long moment before crossing the yard toward him. "My daughter has shared with the others what kindness you showed her." His English was careful and unhurried. "You welcomed her when men on this land chose fear instead. You wanted nothing in return. You gave her a place to be safe while we searched for her." He crossed the yard himself this time, closing the distance to where Daniel stood, and extended a hand in the frontier custom, though something in the gravity of his grip made it feel like far more than a handshake. "There are not many men who would have done what you did. My family will not forget it." Daniel, unused to being thanked for something that had felt, to him, like the plainest kind of decency, only shook his head. "She needed help. That's all I did." One of the other riders, a younger man who had stayed quiet until then, leaned forward from horseback. "We rode through 11 camps and 3 towns looking for her. Most doors we knocked on didn't open at all. Yours did." Daniel had no answer for that, and didn't try to find one. Ayana's father studied him a moment longer, something thoughtful moving behind his eyes, and then he turned back to his daughter, who had finally carefully begun working loose the cord at the mouth of the leather bundle. Beneath the cottonwood where Daniel had first found her, in front of her father and the small circle of riders who had come with him, Ayana laid the contents out one final time. The letters, the medallion, the hand-drawn map, and this time she did not gather them back up in fear. She held them out instead, offering them to her father the way a person offers back something they have kept safe on someone else's behalf. "I carried them the whole way," she said. "I was afraid I would lose them the way I lost everyone else. I did not let them go, not once, not even when I did not know if I would see any of you again." Her father took the papers gently, unfolding the topmost letter with the careful hands of a man handling something sacred. And as he read the first lines, his composure slipped again, briefly before he folded it closed and pressed it to his chest. "These are not lost things." Then looking to Daniel, "These are the memory of our family, the names, the places, The promises made between our people and others who came before you. My daughter did not carry treasure across this territory, though it must have felt that heavy some nights. She carried our history, and she carried it safely home, in no small part because a stranger chose to be kind to her instead of afraid of her. He turned fully to Daniel then, and there was a new formality in his bearing, the weight of something important about to pass between them. Tomorrow we would be honored if you would come with us and see where our daughter grew, and let our people thank you properly for what you have done. It was not a request so easily refused, and in truth, Daniel found he had no wish to refuse it. He looked to Ayana, who was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, open, unguarded, something like pride mixed with relief, and he nodded. I'd be honored. He meant every word of it. They rode out together the next morning, Daniel on his own horse alongside Ayana in her father's party, following a trail that wound up through country he had ridden past for years without ever once seeing what lay beyond the far ridgelines. The community that came into view by mid-morning sat tucked into a wide, sheltered valley. Brush shelters and canvas lodges arranged in loose, purposeful circles around a central clearing, smoke rising thin and steady from several cook fires, children breaking off their games to stare openly at the stranger, riding in among their returning kin. Word of Ayana's return had clearly traveled ahead of them, because by the time they reached the clearing, a crowd had already gathered, and the moment Ayana was recognized among the riders, the whole gathering seemed to exhale at once. A low swell of voices, several women running forward to embrace her, an older woman who could only have been an aunt or a grandmother pressing both hands to Ayana's face, as though needing to confirm with touch what her eyes were already telling her. Daniel dismounted at the edge of the clearing and stood quietly, feeling every inch the outsider he was, taking in details he would remember for years afterward. Women working hides stretched on frames near the cook fires, a row of finished blankets drying in the sun in patterns as fine as any he'd seen, come through the territory on a trader's wagon. An old man teaching a cluster of boys to string a bow with the patient, repeating rhythm of a lesson taught 100 times before and never once rushed. It struck him, standing there, how little of this ordinary richness of daily life ever made it into the stories told about these people back in town. Only the fear, never the craft, the humor, the small domestic details of a life being lived well, despite everything working against it. Ayana's father came and drew him forward by the arm, guiding him toward the center of the gathering, where an older man sat waiting on a woven mat, flanked by several elders whose faces carried the particular stillness of people accustomed to being listened to. This, Ayana's father explained quietly, was the chief who had led their band's long search for the scattered families, the man who had never stopped sending riders out across the territory in the 2 years since the crossing that split them apart. The chief studied Daniel for a long moment with eyes that missed very little, and then gestured for him to sit. What followed was an afternoon Daniel would carry with him the rest of his life. Ayana's father unfolded the letters one by one and read them aloud to the gathered families, his voice carrying across the clearing in a language Daniel didn't understand but felt anyway, in the way the listeners leaned forward, in the way certain names drew soft murmurs of recognition from the older members of the circle, in the way children who couldn't have understood every word still sat perfectly still, sensing the weight of what was being restored to them. An older woman near the front, the same aunt who had pressed both hands to Ayana's face upon her arrival, began quietly weeping partway through, and an even older man beside her reached over and simply held her hand without a word. the two of them listening together to names that plainly meant something neither of them had expected to hear spoken aloud again in this lifetime. The letters, Ayana explained quietly to Daniel afterward, carried the story of her grandmother's generation, names of relatives scattered or lost in earlier hard years, agreements made and broken with settlers and soldiers alike, a careful record of who belonged to whom and where their people had once ranged freely before the lines on maps began deciding otherwise for them. The medallion, it turned out, had belonged to Ayana's grandmother, a gift from her own mother generations back, passed hand to hand through women who had each, in their turn, been trusted to carry something too important to lose during whatever hard season had come for their family next. Ayana was only the latest in that unbroken line of women, her father shared with Daniel later, and perhaps, given all she had survived to bring it home, the one who had carried it the farthest. The hand-drawn map marked the old seasonal camps her family had used for generations, the high country where they wintered, the river bends where they gathered in early summer, places some of the younger members of the band had only ever heard named in passing and did not know still existed on paper, drawn by a relative's careful hand 2 generations before any of them were born. "You did not just save my daughter," the chief said at last once the reading was finished and the clearing had settled into a thoughtful quiet. "You gave her the chance to bring this home. A story like this, once broken, does not often mend itself. You made room for it too." He rose from the woven mat with the unhurried dignity of a man who had earned every one of his years, and one of the women beside him brought forward a blanket, finely woven in deep reds and ochres. Its pattern worked with the same careful, deliberate hands Ayana had described belonging to her own mother. The chief placed it in Daniel's hands himself. "You welcomed our daughter with kindness when kindness cost you something. Because of that, an important part of our family's story has found its way home. We will not forget the man who made that possible." Daniel held the blanket, feeling the weight and care worked into every thread of it, and found himself, for one of the few times in his adult life, without anything adequate to say. "I only did what seemed right," he finally managed, and the chief's expression eased into something almost like a smile. "That," the old man said, "is precisely why it mattered." They stayed through the afternoon, sharing a meal of roasted meat and cornmeal cakes that several of the women pressed on Daniel with a warmth that made plain he was no longer regarded as a stranger passing through. And by the time he and Ayana rode back toward the ranch that evening, the sky behind them had gone the same deep gold it had worn the night he first found her under the cottonwood. Neither of them said much on the ride home, but the silence between them now carried none of the careful distance of that first night, only the easy quiet of 2 people who had come through something together and come out the other side of it whole. The weeks that followed brought a change neither of them had expected, but both, in their own ways, had hoped for. Ayana's people did not vanish back into the hills the way Daniel had half feared they might. Instead, a kind of steady traffic grew up between the ranch and the community in the valley. Riders passing through with news, with trade, with the easy familiarity of neighbors rather than strangers. Ayana herself moved between both worlds now, spending stretches of time with her father's people and returning to help Daniel with the ranch work she'd grown skilled at. No longer carrying the weight of a hidden bundle, only the lighter, freer weight of a person who finally knew exactly where she belonged and was no longer afraid to move between the places that claimed her. Daniel learned things that year he never would have learned any other way. How to read the coming weather in the shape of clouds over the rimrock the way Ayana's father had taught her to. which of the wild plants along the creek bottom could ease a fever or clean a wound. The proper, unhurried patience it took to earn a green colt's trust rather than break it. In turn, he taught members of the community the parts of ranching that were new to them, and more than once found himself riding out at dawn alongside young men from the valley, showing them how to read cattle sign or set a fence line, the exchange running easy and equal in both directions. The uneasy neighbors who had once ridden past with their hats, pulled low, eventually came around too. In the slow-way frontier, opinion tends to shift, not through any grand speech Daniel made, but simply through the plain, accumulating evidence that nothing bad had come of his kindness, only more of it. He hosted a small gathering at the ranch that first autumn at Ayana's suggestion. Nothing grand, just a shared meal under the cottonwood where he'd first found her. Members of both the ranch's usual circle and the valley's family sitting down together at the same long table for what Daniel suspected, though he never asked outright, was the first time either group had done so in that particular stretch of the territory. It was an awkward, halting sort of evening at first, conversation stiff on both sides. But by the time the fire burned low and someone's fiddle came out, the stiffness had worn away into something easier, and Daniel found himself thinking that this, too, was a kind of history being written, not the sort that made it into letters folded soft with age, but the ordinary, unremarkable sort that simply changed, quietly and for good, what a shared evening on this land could look like going forward. Ayana kept teaching him things, long after the leather bundle had found its permanent home in her father's keeping rather than her own. She showed him how to read a set of tracks pressed into soft creek mud and tell how long ago they'd been made, how many animals, how fast they'd been moving, and why. She taught him to recognize the particular silence that settles over a stretch of range right before weather turns, a stillness he'd apparently been riding through half-deaf to for 11 years without ever once noticing it. Daniel, for his part, taught her the paperwork side of ranching that nobody had ever needed to teach her before. Deeds, brands, the county ledgers that decided who the law believed owned what, knowledge she absorbed quickly and without much comment, though Daniel suspected, from the careful way she asked her questions, that she was thinking less about her own future use for it and more about how it might one day help her father's people hold their ground against paper claims the way they had always held it against weather and distance. If this friendship has stayed with you this far, tap join beside the channel name and become a member of this channel. It helps keep stories about kindness like theirs coming. Travelers passing through that stretch of the territory in the seasons after began carrying the story with them the way stories travel on a frontier short on entertainment and long in memory. The tale of the rancher who took in a hunted stranger and asked nothing in return, and the woman who repaid that kindness by carrying her family's history safely home across 2 hard years of searching. Daniel never much cared for the attention it brought him in town, though he noticed with quiet satisfaction that fewer people seemed inclined these days to warn a man away from helping someone who needed it. He kept the woven blanket on the back of the chair nearest his own hearth, where he could see it every evening, a reminder, as if he needed one, that the truest wealth a person can gather in this life rarely announces itself as such at the time it arrives. It doesn't come dressed as treasure. Sometimes it comes dust-worn and frightened, sitting beneath a cottonwood tree at the end of a long day, asking for nothing but a little water and the simple decency of not being turned away. Ayana still visits the ranch often And Daniel still rides out to the valley whenever there's cause, a celebration, a harvest, sometimes nothing more than the excuse of good weather and an open trail between two places that have come to feel, to both of them, like variations on the same word. Home. The friendship between them has outlasted every warning the frontier ever tried to hand either of them, settling instead into something steadier than either could have predicted that first dusty evening. Not a romance, never that, but a bond built stone by careful stone out of trust, patience, and the plain, stubborn choice to be kind when kindness costs something. And if you ask Daniel Harper today what the greatest thing he ever found on his land was, he won't point to the cattle or the water rights or even the woven blanket folded now with careful pride over the back of his favorite chair. He'll tell you it was a hunted young woman under a cottonwood tree who taught him, in the end, that the smallest acts of decency are the ones capable of changing an entire frontier, one open door, one full bucket of water, one choice not to look away at a time.